All right, so we'll start. Cool. So our first session online. Let's see how it goes. So we're on Jira Essentials 3. So we've had 2 sessions already. The first, so this was the plan that we had laid out. So we've covered the first 2 sessions, setting up and planning our work in Jira. Just a quick recap on the first session, we sort of discuss the full picture of what are the aspects about Jira that we need to keep in mind, the core concepts, which involve workflows, issues, and the field types, the field configurations, and specifically the resolution field and how that plays a role in sort of managing the project. And then we looked at the project lifecycle, how we take a concept, break it down into stories, and group it into epics, and then eventually define that into versions and work that through in Jira. So today what we're going to discuss is estimates and tracking. So estimations are one of the key aspects of like planning the work. And they kind of define all the reporting that happens around it. So we'll start with that. So estimations, there's a lot which has been written about estimation, and I guess a lot of us can relate to estimates as a pretty big pain point. When we have to talk to business stakeholders, it's generally a very awkward conversation. How do we actually provide estimates? And there has been a lot of research also that has gone into how to estimate. So the objective of today's session is to actually discuss how we manage estimates. So I'm not going to go too deep into this, but I just want to touch upon what are best practices in estimation. So the traditional methods have been like expert-based, top-down, analogy-based, bottom-up, COCOMO. There are the various sort of approaches that have been used. The simplest one has been analogy-based, which is as simple as saying, okay, this is a project which is similar to another project we did, which took about 3 to 4 months. So this would take about 3 to 4 months. And there are much more detailed approaches like COCOMO and all, which rely on a lot of statistical analysis. The sort of thing that all of these strategies share, or all these approaches share, is that they're all consistently wrong. So they all mostly underestimate. So I mean, we can't really rely on that, and that's when the thinking around how to use a better approach, was really started out, and that's where the way we do estimates now, most agile teams, the way they estimate is based on complexities. So what is a complexity-based estimation? A lot of us are familiar with this. I mean, some of us are using in the project, but there are quite a few of us who've recently started out. So to make sure everybody understands what complexity-based estimation is, I'll just walk through a quick overview of what exactly do we do when we're estimating for complexity. So typically the question that we have, so we all understand how to break down stories and how to create stories, but the question about like how to estimate a story, it can be either. So the main factor or the main aspect that we need to know when we are estimating something is how much time would it take. But time is very hard to estimate, and there are various factors which go into sort of defining how much time a story will take. There are meetings which come in. There are things you could get stuck in. So it's a very complex task to actually complete a story. So typically the approach we instead we take in a complexity-based estimation is we don't bother with estimating time. We really think about how complex is a story, and complexity could be in terms of uncertainty, ambiguity, and sort of things that we don't know. So that's the sort of lens with which we start looking at a story. And before we even start estimating, what we definitely need to make sure that is we have enough information about the story to really think, think about how complex it is, and that's what is ensured by having a proper acceptance criteria, which is based on definition of done, part of definition of done. So a story is really ready to be estimated. All the design artifacts that we need are all prepared. We've had a we had an engineering discussion on the aspects of the story and thought through a bit of the architecture of how we'll design it. That gives us much more confidence on what it's going to take to build a story. And after we've done that, and typically one of the other steps also is breaking down the story further into smaller stories if the story seems pretty large. So once we've done all of that, then basically starts the process of estimating complexity. And the way we do it is using a technique called planning poker. So the engineering team, and this involves everyone. So the engineering team, the entire team will come together, and we'll sort of look at a story and say, how complex is it? And people will provide their own estimates based on their instincts. And they would say, okay, this is about a half-point story. This is a one-point story. And we estimate using Fibonacci series. We don't estimate using a linear scale. The reason why we do that is the reason why Fibonacci is most preferred. I mean, we can use other techniques also, like t-shirt sizes, small, medium, large. We could use approaches. Yeah, I mean, like, so small, medium, large is another approach. But Fibonacci is generally used because it forces you to think about estimation in relative sizes. So there is a really good article also by Dan Knott, which I can share later, which you could read about the perils of estimation. So coming back to estimation using planning poker. Sorry, there's someone who's not on mute. Yeah, thanks. So the process of estimating using story points and using planning poker is the team comes together, they provide, they think about all the aspects based on the discussions they've had earlier and provide an estimate saying, okay, this is a 1-point story, this is a 2-point story. Now, how do you decide what's a 2-point story and what's a 1-point story? So you define first a baseline story and say, okay, this story, let's all agree it's a 1-point. And it's fairly simple, fairly straightforward. I know it's not very complicated, so let's define this as a baseline story. And now the other stories, we start estimating based on a relative complexity of how relatively more or less complex is it compared to the baseline story. So when we look at our next story and say, okay, this is about twice as complex, or maybe 3 times as complex, or maybe 5 times as complex as our baseline story, then we would give it a 5, or 3, or 2 accordingly. And this is how estimation happens. And this chart that you see on the right gives you a sense of the size, right? So when you talk about a 5-point story versus a 2-point story, you can see the difference in the size and gauge, like you can kind of map it to your story complexity and say, okay, if it's a 5-point story, it should be about that much more complex than a 2-point story. And what the Fibonacci series also allows you to do is the numbers keep getting a lot larger because the uncertainty as it increases, it needs to actually reflect in the number that you use to estimate it. When you're estimating, once you've put your story points, typically what you do is you triangulate. And for that, you can see the slide below. We put all the stories as in different buckets. And then we generally get a sense of, okay, does it look like, do all the 8-point stories look similar in size? If they're not, then we kind of adjust. And if the stories are very large and if they are seeming very uncertain, then we question whether we can break them down into smaller stories and then work with them. So that's typically like the sort of suggested way we should be looking at estimating stories. And the idea is not to get into an analysis paralysis situation in this process, remembering that estimates are estimates, they're not commitments. We all are engineers, we know how complex software development is as a process. So this is to just basically set up ourselves to get better and better at estimation. Also, one point, so estimation gets better with practice. So that's the whole basis behind using story points as an estimation, so as estimation methodology. So you kind of disconnect yourself from the idea of having to estimate in days, and that's something you discover, like how many story points you actually take to deliver within a week, and that sets what we call your velocity. So velocity is basically how many story points are you completing every week, and that's what defines what you can now predict or project how much you will be able to complete in subsequent weeks, and that helps in planning. So always what that means is the first few sprints that you do, your velocity, your estimates of how much story points you can complete very likely will be off from the actual velocity. But what it will help you do is keep on with every sprint. It'll help you keep refining how many story points you're actually able to achieve, and then that will set your baseline velocity, which you can expect to work with. So coming back to Jira, I mean, there's a lot about estimation that we can discuss, but I just wanted to quickly go through that so that we can come to the main agenda of how do we actually use story points, and how do we leverage the reporting features in Jira. And I see Christian's also on the call, so he's a great guy to actually go to if you want to learn more about estimation. So coming back to this story, so where do we track these estimates, right? So in this is what a story looks like in Jira. Where do we estimate? It's right here, story points. And how do we set it up in Jira? It's in the board. So where we have, if you remember, where we looked at with board settings in the estimation section, there is an option where you can choose either story points or time. Also, as a way to measure, as a way to estimate, we generally, in our teams, we use story points to estimate. So I'm just going to cover that. So let's do a quick estimation exercise. We have this demo project that we used in the previous session. So we have 3 stories out here that we discussed. So let's see what happens and where we estimate things. So here you can see story points as a field. So if you do a quick planning poker, I need 2 volunteers to do the planning poker with me out here. Anyone up for it? Or I'm going to just go ahead and pick. Okay. So let's say, let's take Cedric. Do you want to?
Sure.
Okay. And we'll take our 2 new joinees. So Sankalp and Dinesh, are you guys on the call?
Yeah, I am on the call.
Okay, great. So the 4 of us will go ahead and estimate these stories. Okay. And then we'll see how the board looks like on estimating them. So let's say this first, so the first story, as a registered user, I should be able to retrieve my password if I forget, so that I'm not locked out of my account. So assume that out here, of course, we don't have a lot of discussion, but assume you have the UI and you have all the details, the non-functional requirements, all specified here, and that gives you enough information to estimate this correctly. So how many story points do you think? Just kind of think about the story points you think it should take in your mind, and then we'll just together share what we thought about. So I'm ready with my story points.
So do we assume we do all the development for that, right? Front end, back end, the whole flow, right?
Correct. Yeah, that's a good question. It's a good point. So it basically, you should estimate from end to end. So from the time that you'll start working on it to actually delivering it to UAT, or to UAT. This is an exercise, so we'll just sort of use it as a example. Of course, you'll get a bit more time to think through these aspects. So are you sort of ready? Have some number in mind, all 3 of you?
Yeah, I'm between two numbers, actually.
Okay, cool. So let's start with sharing your numbers. So Cedric, Sankalp, Dinesh, you guys can go ahead in that sequence.
So I would go with 5 or 8. I don't have much knowledge in backend development, so I would say 8.
Mm-hmm.
My assumptions would be that we need to do all the wiring up with the security for the password, regenerate the password.
Mm-hmm.
And then for the front end, it would be just 1 or 2 points to have the screen and the routing for that.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be around 5 to 8 points.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Sankalp, Dinesh.
Yeah, I will go with 4 to 6 point, I guess.
So this is so you've got to use the Fibonacci series. So you can choose between numbers as 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13. So, and thinking about relative complexities, like 5 is 5 times more complex than 1, and so on and so forth. Yeah. So you got to choose between these numbers.
So 5, I guess.
5. Okay. And Dinesh? Hello, Dinesh, are you there? Okay, so his network is slow, so that's fine. So we can share. So my thought was, I was thinking around 3, but then I didn't consider the aspects of security related to the password, and hence I would probably revise my sort of story points also to 5. Now this is an example of how a discussion evolves in a estimation exercise. It's Cedric provided his estimate, and then he provided his reasons for his estimation. He provided certain points, and then people who are estimating differently, they hear their points, and then they discuss this and then align on a commonly shared story point that they believe is a sort of baseline that they can set, right? And then, and by the way, in this discussion, we could hear everyone else's story points, and there's a potential of groupthink. So I don't know if Sankalp said 5 because Cedric said 5, but there's a possibility that when you hear somebody else's story points, you could end up saying the same points. But in reality, we all do it as a blindfolded exercise. We all set up points and then share it together, and which is why it's called poker. That's how poker works. So so yeah, that's how it happens in reality. So you don't get those biases, and then you of course have the option to discuss and then align on a commonly shared understanding of what story points should each story be given. So similarly,
Rahul here. So for forgot email, forgot password, there should be a email notification that should be considered in the scope, or no?
Yeah, so that's a separate story point. That's a separate story. So as a registered user, I should be able to authenticate my account through email so that nobody other than me can create my fake account.
That's sign up, right?
Yeah. So what are you talking about?
So forgot password, there should be a notification.
Right. Yeah. So there should be an email which should be sent out, right? So the part about how do you integrate an email? Yeah. So exactly. So that's another additional point, right? So did all of us consider that? Maybe not, and that would probably make it slightly more complex. So we could end up revising it to maybe an 8 if all of us agree that we didn't think about that aspect. Right?
Okay, I have like a point here. So for example, if we agree that yes, we will be sending an email notification for which we might be using some third-party API as of now, which require like client interaction in terms of setting up the account, and also in such kind of a case, will you recommend like creating another story for it, or like how will we handle this? this particular scenario then?
Yeah, so that kind of goes down to the basic principle of what a story should, how a story should be written. So a story should be written in a manner that it can actually deliver real business value. So if without sending an email, you're not able to complete a story, it shouldn't be a half-baked story, right? So it shouldn't be something which does not really deliver any business value. It can be completed, but still people can't see an end-to-end demo and say, okay, this works. So that's the basic philosophy or approach to writing user stories, so sort of basic thinking behind writing user stories. So when you say that if an email can be carved out as a separate story, if that doesn't fulfill the ultimate objective of being able to retrieve my password, so if I forgot it, then it should not be created as a separate story. It can be created as a subtask to this story, but I would suggest we create it as when we kind of include it as part of the story. Again, everybody has, this is not, Agile doesn't really define very strictly how you should go about creating stories. You, as a team, decide how you want to approach it, but this is how I would suggest we could think about it.
Yep. Okay.
Brian, for this particular story, the forget password, I guess with regards to the question of the third-party integration and everything for the mailing system, I guess the complexity would depend on which story will be or is already implemented before. Let's say in a previous story, we already have third-party email integration. Then we don't need to do that again. So the complexity is lower than as it's higher.
Yeah, no, absolutely valid point. And that's exactly the kind of argument you would present to again, align or bring the story points back to 5, for instance. So you see my basic point being that this is the objective of planning poker. You estimate, you share your assumptions, you share your thoughts around what's complex, what's not complex. You help adjust everybody else's sort of thinking or thought or understanding of the complexity, and ultimately align on a commonly shared understanding of what a 5-point story really looks like. How complex does it look like? Does that make sense?
Makes sense to me.
Great. Yeah. So, and this is the good part, right? So this it doesn't constrain you in terms of thinking of estimates in terms of time. So it's just about how complex is it, and that's what we're trying to establish. So similarly, we'll go ahead and let's say assign story points to another story. So let's say as a registered user, I should be able to authenticate my account through email so that nobody other than me can create my fake account. So what this really requires is when you enter your email in the sign up page, it sends an email to your actual email address where you can click a link and validate whether you're the actual user who's trying to sign up or not. This would require you to create a unique link, which is sent to the email, which is emailed to you, and then you have to click and authenticate within a certain time frame to confirm that whether you're the authorized person trying to sign up for an account or not. There could be other requirements around this as well, but now let's try and estimate this. Cedric, Sankalp, and I can do that quickly. Keeping this as a baseline story now, we have a 5-point story which is as complex as this. So keeping that in mind, let's do a quick thinking about what this could be, like how many points, and keeping in mind that this is we have to estimate in Fibonacci series. Right. So are we ready?
Okay, I would go with 3 on my side because the email has to be sent, and then the user has to be able to click on the link, and I think automatically be authenticated or at least validated. So the mail is sent first, the user clicks the links, which makes another request that has to be handled on the server. So that's why I would go with actually 3 points.
Circle.
Given that the mailing is the mailing system is already available based on the previous story.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, that makes sense to me also. I would also go with 3. Yeah.
Okay. Great. I had a 3 in mind. So great. See, we're already aligning, right? So I think having this 5-point story also helped in setting a benchmark of what our baseline should be, and is it more complex or less complex? And we know like the kind of things we need to do are relatively less and fewer and less complicated than we would need to do in this in the first story. All right, so we've completed our estimation exercise. We'll leave one story for the next sprint, and we pull this into the sprint. And we see that the estimate starts appearing here. We have an 8-point that we have planned for our first sprint. And when we start the sprint, this is what we are trying to aim for. So we say, okay, we think we can do 8 points in the first sprint. We'll discover how many points we actually end up doing and what our actual velocity was, and that will help us, that will guide us in setting the velocity for the future sprints. But let's start with an 8 points as our initial estimate, and then we start the sprint, right? And we keep one story for later. Right?
Fran, I have a question concerning the poker planning. While working remotely, what are your suggestions for a proper poker planning?
Yeah, so there are lots of tools called Planet Poker, like which is one of which allows you to do planning poker remotely. So you can list out all the stories. Like this is a board which is already set up. So you can list out all the stories that you want to estimate, and then you have these cards. So each one can view these set of cards, and they can select how much what they want to estimate for each story. And then once everyone's ready, when the voting is finished, then everyone can see each other's scores, and then they have a discussion around what they felt and why there is difference.
All right.
So that really helps make it easy. So we can use that in our project. Does that answer? Yeah, does that answer the question? Yeah.
Cool. Yes, thank you.
Okay, so once we've got our estimates and we have our boards set up and we have these story points as we're working through our sprints, now we need to report to our business stakeholders, and we need to be able to plan our work using these. I mean, as we are sort of progressing through work and as we are continuing to estimate stories, and sorry. Yeah, so that's where reports come in. So once we have all our basic metrics in place, there is a whole suite of reports that are available in Jira to actually monitor our progress, see how we're doing, and be able to help plan and forecast better. A lot of business stakeholders ask us, like, by when will you get your work done? When can I see this feature? When can I see this epic? And you really don't need to spend time creating extensive Excel sheets and reports to do that. Jira provides you pretty extensive reports to help business stakeholders and for your own self to get that visibility. So I'll introduce you to a few reports here, but I would encourage you to have a look at the report section of Jira, where a lot of these things are logged. A lot of these things are available. So starting with the Burndown chart. Now, many of you might have used the Burndown chart. This is basically how it looks like. This is the most basic form of reporting. So what this shows is at the start of every sprint, how many points did we commit to? So like in this case, you can see there were 40 points that was committed to by the team. In our case, it was 8 points, as we saw. And as we keep on, and this sort of gray line that you see is a guideline. So if this is, you can see, is a 3-week sprint. So in 3 weeks, you can see this is the ideal burn down, how it should look like. This is how we should keep on finishing stories so that we can complete all the stories by the end of our sprint. And if ideally things go well as planned, then this is how it should, the red line is how it should, the actual sort of burn down should look like. As every time you complete a story and you move it to resolve, basically the resolution field is set and you move it to accepted or done, whichever is your resolution column, and it sort of falls, this line falls. And then, eventually at the end of the week, you can see how far you were from your actual estimate. Okay. So this is gray is your guideline. This is your actual progress, and this is the number of story points. So, quick question here. So, I'm going to ask you guys a few questions so that you to know that if you've got this. So what happened here? Like on the first point, when you see what is 40, can somebody tell me what's this number 40? Or what's this point?
Total estimated value.
Yeah, correct. So it's basically what we committed to, right? So what we started out with. So that's what happened here. So the red dot and the gray dot, the gray line and the red line, they start at the same point. What happens here at this point when the red line drops?
Basically, we have burned down, we have done those stories.
Correct. Yeah, so we've completed those stories. And what do you mean by completing those stories? In sort of practical terms on the board?
Resolution as set, or we have moved that to done.
Right, exactly. So if I move this to done, this is what it looks like. Let's actually also open the report. So let's open our Burndown chart here and see how this is looking like for our current sprint so far. You can actually view this chart as you are going through your sprint as well. So you see, we burned down a 5-point story because the time is like, we've set it as a 1-week sprint starting on a Wednesday. We've really burnt it down on the first day itself. So started with 8 and we've got 3 left. Next, what happens here when the red line goes up?
Some stories are added up, I guess.
Added up as in?
Some issues come up in that story.
Initially,
story to earn like more points.
Yeah, it could be
Sorry?
re-estimation. Like a story was initially estimated, say for example 2, then it was revised to 4, or
Right.
a new ticket with of course estimation was added in the sprint. So the overall sprint got increased.
Right, correct. So it could be either a re-estimation or it could be a new story which was in the backlog, which we decided to pull up because it was high priority. So any reason which causes, let's say, like we have this one story here and we estimate it at 2 points, let's say. And now we move it to this sprint. So what we're doing is, so this says you have an alert saying sprint scope will be affected by this action, and GT5 will be moved from the backlog to the sprint. So we confirm this, and now the estimate has gone up for this sprint. Now we have 5 points remaining, and when we look at the report, you'll see exactly what you saw Right. So you see that this is the latest point. So this line went back up to 5 points. So you see the delta of story points was 2. And you can see a action by action detailed report of what's happening. So when we started the sprint, we had 8 points that we added and 8 were remaining. Then we burned down 5 points. So 3 were remaining. Then we added 2 points. And then hence 5 are remaining now. And so you get like a activity by activity update on how the sprint's going. Cool. What happened here? This should be easy.
Holiday.
Right. There's a weekend. Okay. Maybe what happened here? This was a weekend. What happened on December 26th? If it was a working day.
None of the stories got delivered.
Right. Yeah. So no progress. Right. So cool. So this is the most important chart. Like gives you a lot of insight on how your sprint is evolving over time, and helps you understand a lot better. Where things are going wrong. You can actually look at this chart and also figure out where things went wrong. What are the points of re-estimation, and these are very useful in your retrospectives to understand how to make your sprints better. So here, as we see, we didn't achieve all the story points that we committed to, and that's fine. So we were 5 points lower, and if it was a sprint which was normal with all kinds of meetings that we would expect, all anticipated disruptions and sort of adjustments, then the next time we'll try and commit to, let's say, 35 story points and see if we actually are able to consistently achieve that velocity. So velocity is basically the number of story points that you actually deliver in a sprint, per sprint. And that provides your guideline of what you should be aiming for. And for that, you also have a chart called velocity chart. So you can see out here for every sprint, this is what lets you look at what was your project, what was your committed velocity. So we committed, in this case, in the sprint 21, 55 points, achieved only 40 points. So green is the bar which tells you what you achieved. Sorry, my mouse is acting up. So yeah, so this gives you a historical view of how you've been doing. So sprint 24 was a great sprint, where you achieved exactly what you anticipated, and so on. And so that's how you can basically also track how well you're doing. An epic burn down is a chart which lets you see a burn down for a particular epic. So out here you can you can kind of filter by a particular epic. You can see what points you committed to, which is specific to that epic. And with every sprint, this is a sprint by sprint view, not a within sprint view. So with every sprint, how many points were remaining, how many, the one is in green, or how many you actually burned down, and how many were added. So this is the total remaining work that we need to complete. And over time, as this keeps on reducing, as you keep on burning down more and more stories and adding fewer stories, you reach a point where you can also see a projected sprints. Like Jira will tell you how many more sprints based on how you've been tracking, how many more sprints would you need to complete a specific epic. You have a similar chart for releases. So in releases also, you can see when you started, you had 0 original estimate, and then you added 13 points to start with. And then as you went through completing various epics, various stories, added a few story points and started burning down over time based on how much time you took to get to this point. Jira will help you predict how many more sprints would you need to get your release out. A version report is also a very interesting report. It's sort of similar to a release burn down, but it helps you predict your release dates. So out here, what you see in gray is the total story points. So when you estimate for a particular release, let's say you have a total of 60 story points that you need to complete. And as you start completing them, the blue graph starts rising. So as you start approaching your, and of course, it also accommodates, as you can see, your estimations and re-estimations, your additions, and it also tells you how many of your issues are currently not estimated, because there will always be a few issues which you don't estimate. So ideally, when you reach a point where there are no issues which are unestimated, then it will give you a much more accurate picture of what's the gap between total story points that are remaining and total how many you've completed. So what's the gap? And then it does a linear extrapolation to tell you that if we are going at this particular rate when we started out on November 1st and we're in January, whatever, like this 25th or whatever we are, and we've completed these many points of the total that we currently have right now, and this is the rate at which we're going, then we can estimate to be completing all our work by April 1st. And this is the range of error. So it could be on a aggressive, on an aggressive basis, it would be earlier, and it would be later by that much. So it gives you a range by when you can expect to complete a particular release. Control charts, they give you a more like sort of deeper understanding of issue by issues, like how you've been doing. So this plots the issues on a elapsed time basis chart and gives you a rolling average of what is the average time it takes for you to complete each issue. So each green dot on this chart is basically an issue. If you hover over the green dot, you get, if you hover over this line, you get a sense of like what's been your sort of average days you're taking to complete each issue. And if there are lots of issues which are taking around the same time, they get clustered into a sort of darker green dot. So the red line you see is an average time taken for across all issues. You can adjust the time frame that you want here, and you can also refine the report to only select issues which were in certain columns and filter them by that. And the blue line is a rolling average. So the red line is the average across the entire time period, and the blue line is the rolling average across a 9-issue window. In this case, you can adjust that, of course. So what this means is, in the last 9 issues, at let's say at this point, over the last 9 issues, if you just take the last 9 issues, then the average time you took to complete each issue was about 10 days. And a few days later, you can see that the issues that you were starting to complete were taking a lot less time, and hence the rolling average dropped. So if you take at this point, the rolling average of the last 9 issues, which were taking a lot less time, pull down the average, and now you're taking a lot less, maybe about 5 days or something. And as issues start taking more time, then your rolling average keeps going up. And the red one is a flat average across all the issues that you've completed so far. So that gives you a sense, this starts also helping you understand how much time do you take on average to complete each issue. Right, so those are the key charts that I wanted to take you through. So the most important ones. Encourage you to have a look at on your own projects, try and look through them. There are lots of other charts also, like for example, you can look at time since issues, like how much time has it been since an issue was reported. So this is quite useful to see, like, okay, the first time, like there is one issue which has been reported since 24th Feb, but not yet happened. Most issues, you can see 9 issues reported on 9th of March, still not completed. So this is basically the number of issues which are still pending ever since they were created over the last 30 days. So, and you can of course adjust the time frame. So yeah. That's really it. I mean, I just wanted to take you through some of these charts, but there are lots of reports, as you can see, and in Jira there's even more. So have a look at them. There is also a really good documentation on reports, which you can find on this presentation, and you can start doing your own analysis. That's it.